What if Captain Nemo was never the enemy of humanity? What if the real tragedy is that he believed in humanity more than most of us ever will? For generations, readers have looked at Nemo and seen a man in exile. A man hiding beneath the ocean. A man who turned his back on the world. And at first glance, that interpretation makes sense. After all, who builds an entire life beneath thousands of feet of water unless they've given up on the surface? But here's the contradiction that should make us stop. People who truly hate humanity don't preserve its greatest achievements. They don't carry its art into the darkness. They don't protect its knowledge. They don't dedicate themselves to understanding the world with obsessive curiosity. They don't build libraries in the middle of nowhere. And they certainly don't spend their lives proving what human intelligence is capable of accomplishing. So what exactly was Captain Nemo rejecting? Was it humanity itself? Or was it something far more specific and far more disturbing? Because the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to see Nemo as a simple misanthrope. In fact, the evidence points in the opposite direction. The man at the center of this story doesn't feel like someone who stopped caring. He feels like someone who cared too much. And that's a very different kind of wound. Think about it for a moment. Who experiences the deepest disappointment? The person who never believed in anything? Or the person who devoted their heart to an ideal, only to watch it collapse? That's where Nemo becomes more than a literary character. He becomes a symbol. A symbol of what happens when faith in civilization breaks before faith in human potential does. Because those two things are not the same. You can lose trust in institutions and still believe in people. You can lose faith in governments and still admire human creativity. You can walk away from a civilization while secretly mourning what it could have been. And suddenly, a strange image begins to emerge. A lone vessel moving through the silent darkness of the deep ocean. Not as a machine of escape, but as a monument. A monument built by a man who could no longer live with the distance between humanity's promises and humanity's reality. That's what makes the Nautilus such a powerful memory fragment. It isn't just a submarine. It feels almost like an alternate civilization. A floating question mark hidden beneath the sea. If the world above was truly worth saving, why did Nemo need to build another one below? And that question becomes even more unsettling when we scale it beyond fiction. Because every era creates its own versions of Nemo. People who once believed deeply in systems, movements, institutions, nations, or ideals. People who didn't become cynical because they lacked hope. They became cynical because hope failed them. The common assumption is that idealism and disillusionment are opposites. But what if they're actually connected? What if the people most likely to withdraw from civilization are not those who never loved it, but those who loved it enough to be devastated by its contradictions? And if that's true, then Captain Nemo may represent something much larger than one man's isolation. He may represent a question that every civilization eventually has to face. What happens when the people who believe in your ideals the most are the first to stop believing in you? But there is another layer to this puzzle that makes Nemo far more unsettling than a disappointed idealist. If he had completely lost faith in humanity, his story would actually be simple. Simple stories are easy to explain. A person is betrayed, becomes bitter, and walks away. We've seen that pattern countless times. Nemo doesn't fit that pattern. Because even after withdrawing from civilization, he remains obsessed with the things that civilization was supposed to represent. Knowledge. Discovery. Beauty. Human potential. And that creates a contradiction that refuses to disappear. Why would a man spend his life preserving the highest achievements of humanity if he truly believed humanity was beyond redemption? The answer may lie in the difference between loving people and loving what people could become. Those are not the same thing. In fact, some of the deepest conflicts in history emerge from that gap. The reformer who becomes disillusioned with institutions. The patriot who loses faith in a nation. The believer who questions a church. The scientist who watches knowledge become power. Again and again, the pattern repeats itself. Not because hope disappears, but because hope collides with reality. And that brings us back to one of the most powerful symbols in this entire story. The library beneath the sea. Think about that image. A vast collection of human thought hidden beneath the ocean floor. A memory fragment suspended between admiration and rejection. The library exists because Nemo values human knowledge. But its location reveals something else. He trusts the knowledge. He no longer trusts the civilization surrounding it. That distinction changes everything. Because the deeper we go, the less Nemo looks like a man running from humanity. Instead, he begins to resemble a judge examining humanity from a distance. Not a conqueror. Not a destroyer. A judge. And judges are dangerous for a very specific reason. They measure reality against standards. The higher the standard, the harsher the disappointment. This is where the emotional consequence begins to expand beyond one fictional character. Most people assume cynicism comes from low expectations. But often the opposite is true. The most profound cynicism is born from enormous expectations that were never fulfilled. The people who expect nothing are rarely devastated. The people who expect greatness often are. Suddenly, Nemo becomes recognizable. Not because we share his circumstances, but because we recognize his psychological pattern. Who hasn't experienced some version of this? A dream that failed. A cause that disappointed. A community that betrayed its own values. A promise that sounded noble until reality exposed its flaws. The scale shifts. What looked like an adventure beneath the sea starts to resemble a study of moral injury. Not physical injury. Moral injury. The wound that appears when reality violates something you believed should have been true. And once that wound forms, something strange happens. People don't always stop caring. Sometimes they care even more. They become obsessed. They analyze. They criticize. They withdraw. Not because the ideal meant nothing to them, but because it meant everything. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the opposite of love is not hatred. Maybe the opposite of love is indifference. And if that's true, then hatred and disappointment may actually reveal a hidden attachment rather than its absence. That idea changes the meaning of Nemo's isolation. The ocean no longer feels like a prison. It feels like a courtroom. A place where civilization itself is being put on trial. And that leads us directly into a deeper mystery. If Nemo is acting as a judge, then what evidence convinced him that civilization deserved condemnation in the first place? More importantly, was he judging humanity for what it had done? Or for what it failed to become? But here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. What if the problem was never that civilization failed to live up to its ideals? What if the problem is that civilization has always depended on that failure? At first, that sounds absurd. We like to think of progress as a steady climb. Knowledge expands. Technology advances. Living standards improve. Humanity learns from its mistakes and moves forward. That is the story modern civilization tells about itself. Yet figures like Nemo force us to confront a disturbing contradiction. If progress alone were enough, why do the same moral fractures keep reappearing across different eras? Different governments. Different cultures. Different centuries. And yet the same patterns emerge. Power accumulates. Ideals become institutions. Institutions become systems. Systems begin serving themselves. Then the gap between what is promised and what is delivered starts to widen. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. This is where Nemo's role becomes larger than that of a disappointed observer. He functions as a diagnostic tool. A living measurement of that gap. The larger the gap becomes, the more understandable his withdrawal starts to seem. And that creates a contradiction at the center of his legacy. Most rebels want to change the world. Nemo does not seem interested in reforming it. Most revolutionaries seek followers. Nemo chooses isolation. Most critics demand. Attention. Nemo disappears beneath the surface. Why? Because perhaps he has already reached a terrifying conclusion. Perhaps some systems cannot be corrected from within. Now the scale shifts again. This is no longer about one man beneath the ocean. This is about a recurring crisis that appears whenever human beings build civilizations. Every society creates ideals. Freedom. Justice. Truth. Human dignity. Then reality collides with those ideals. And when that collision becomes severe enough, two kinds of people emerge. The first group lowers its expectations. The second group refuses. The first adapts. The second suffers. Nemo belongs to the second category. That distinction matters because history often celebrates pragmatists while quietly being haunted by idealists. Pragmatists keep systems functioning. Idealists keep asking whether those systems deserve to exist. And those questions can become dangerous. Not because they destroy civilizations, but because they expose weaknesses that civilizations would rather ignore. Consider another memory fragment. A single man standing before a vast observation window beneath the sea. On one side, an entire civilization. On the other, endless darkness. Most viewers instinctively assume the darkness represents isolation. But what if the symbolism works in reverse? What if the darkness represents honesty? What if distance allows Nemo to see something that proximity hides? Because one of the oldest truths about human nature is this: when people are deeply invested in a system, they often become blind to its contradictions. Distance can reveal what participation conceals. And suddenly another possibility appears. Maybe Nemo is not escaping civilization. Maybe he is conducting an experiment. An experiment with a single question: what remains of human greatness when you remove power, status, politics, and social approval? That question transforms the meaning of everything around him. The ocean becomes more than a setting. It becomes a filter. A place where illusions are stripped away. A place where only essentials remain. Knowledge. Discipline. Curiosity. Self-sufficiency. Yet even here the contradiction refuses to disappear. Because if Nemo truly found the answer he was searching for, why does his story still feel unresolved? Why does his isolation never feel like peace? Why does the Nautilus feel less like a home and more like a monument? Monuments are not built for the future. They are built for something that has already been lost. And that may be the most important clue so far. Perhaps Nemo is not preserving humanity's greatest achievements because he believes they will triumph. Perhaps he is preserving them because he fears they might vanish. If that is true, then the deepest conflict is not between Nemo and civilization. It is between hope and memory. Between the world humanity could become and the world it repeatedly chooses to build. And once that possibility enters the picture, a much larger mystery begins to emerge. What if Nemo's greatest disappointment was not that civilization was corrupt? What if his greatest disappointment was realizing that civilization might understand its own flaws perfectly well, and continue choosing them anyway? What if the deepest revelation is not that Nemo lost faith in civilization, but that he understood something civilization itself struggles to admit? Every civilization tells a story about what it values. It speaks of justice, wisdom, progress, dignity, and human flourishing. Yet those values are invisible. They exist only as ideas until people choose to embody them. And that is where the real fracture begins. Because civilizations are not betrayed by their enemies first. They are betrayed when the distance between their ideals and their behavior becomes so large that nobody can ignore it anymore. This is the revelation hidden beneath the ocean. Nemo is not merely a critic of institutions. He represents a terrifying question: what happens when a person stops judging civilization by what it has achieved and starts judging it by what it promised? That shift changes everything. Success no longer becomes proof of virtue. Power no longer becomes proof of wisdom. Progress no longer becomes proof of moral growth. Suddenly, an uncomfortable possibility emerges. A civilization can become more advanced while becoming less trustworthy. It can accumulate knowledge while losing meaning. It can conquer nature while failing to conquer its own contradictions. That is why one of the most powerful symbols in this story is not the ocean itself. It is the observation window. Imagine standing behind thick glass, surrounded by miles of dark water, watching a world that you no longer belong to. The window creates a strange paradox. It allows vision without participation, understanding without belonging, clarity without comfort. As a memory fragment, it represents something profound. Nemo does not close his eyes to humanity. He watches it more carefully than most people ever do. The distance is not blindness. The distance is perspective. And that perspective leads to another revelation. Perhaps Nemo's true role is not that of an exile. Perhaps he is a witness. Throughout history, civilizations have often feared witnesses more than opponents. Opponents attack from the outside. Witnesses expose what is already there. They force societies to confront realities they would rather explain away. And once that process begins, the consequences become impossible to contain. The scale expands beyond one character, beyond one novel, beyond one century. Because every generation inherits the same dilemma. Do we measure ourselves by our intentions or by our outcomes? By our ideals or by our behavior? By what we claim to value or by what we repeatedly choose? Entire cultures can survive military threats. They can survive economic crises. They can survive political upheaval. What they struggle to survive is the gradual erosion of trust between ideals and reality. Once people stop believing that the gap can be closed, something essential begins to disappear. Not obedience. Not stability. Something deeper. Legitimacy. Meaning. Hope. And now another symbol begins to reveal its hidden significance. The Nautilus itself. Not as a machine. Not as a refuge. But as a question cast into the depths of the ocean. What would human greatness look like if it were separated from the institutions that claim to represent it? That question transforms the entire meaning of Nemo's journey. Because perhaps he is not searching for isolation at all. Perhaps he is searching for proof. Proof that the highest possibilities of humanity can still exist somewhere untouched by compromise. And if that is what he is searching for, then a far greater revelation begins to take shape. What if the real tragedy is not that Nemo lost faith in civilization? What if the real tragedy is that civilization kept giving him reasons to hold its ideals higher than it could ever live up to them? Before we go any further, we have to ask a deeper question. What was Nemo actually trying to protect? Not a nation. Not a political system. Not even a particular vision of society. The answer is far more fundamental than that. The core revelation hidden beneath this story is that Nemo is not defending humanity as it exists. He is defending humanity as a possibility. That distinction changes everything. Most readers approach the conflict as if it were a struggle between an individual and a civilization. But beneath the surface lies a more profound tension. Nemo is caught between two versions of humanity. The first is the humanity that exists in reality, flawed, contradictory, capable of extraordinary achievements and devastating failures. The second is the humanity that exists as an ideal, the humanity that could emerge if its highest values were fully realized. The tragedy is that Nemo never stops believing in the second version. That is why his disappointment becomes so immense. People do not suffer because reality falls short of perfection. They suffer when reality falls short of meaning. And Nemo's wound is ultimately a wound of meaning. Consider another memory fragment. A silent library beneath miles of water. Shelves filled with knowledge accumulated across centuries. Ideas preserved from every corner of the human experience. That image reveals something crucial. Nemo never abandons what is best in humanity. He abandons what prevents humanity from becoming its best self. This is the insight many people miss. His withdrawal is not rooted in contempt. It is rooted in an impossible standard. he measures civilization against its own highest promises. And once he adopts that standard, ordinary compromises begin to look like betrayals. Ordinary failures begin to look like symptoms of something much larger. The contradiction becomes clear. The more seriously someone takes an ideal, the harder it becomes to tolerate the gap between that ideal and reality. This pattern extends far beyond one fictional character. Throughout history, some of the most influential critics of civilization were not people who lacked hope. They were people whose hopes exceeded what their societies could deliver. The scale now expands beyond literature. Nemo becomes an archetype that appears again and again across human history. The reformer who becomes disillusioned. The visionary who withdraws. The believer who loses trust in institutions while refusing to abandon the values those institutions were supposed to serve. In each case, the conflict remains the same. The battle is not between cynicism and optimism. It is between reality and possibility. Between what humanity is and what humanity could be. This realization transforms the meaning of the Nautilus itself. It is not simply a vessel moving through the ocean. It is a floating thought experiment. A question cast into the depths. What would remain if everything artificial was stripped away? What values would survive? What forms of greatness would endure? In that sense, the Nautilus becomes less of a refuge and more of a test. A test of whether human excellence can exist without the structures that often distort it. And this is where the deepest philosophical consequence begins to emerge. If Nemo's greatest loyalty is not to civilization but to humanity's unrealized potential, then his story is not fundamentally about rejection. It is about grief. The grief that appears when a person realizes that what they love and what actually exists are no longer the same thing. But that realization opens an even larger question. If the highest ideals of humanity inspire both greatness and disappointment, then what becomes of a person who refuses to abandon those ideals even after losing faith in the world that claims to represent them? The consequence of that realization is far heavier than it first appears. When a person loses faith in a system but continues believing in the values that system was supposed to protect, the conflict does not end. In many ways, it becomes permanent. That is the legacy left behind by figures like Nemo. The cost is not merely isolation. The cost is carrying an ideal that no longer has a home. Imagine the image that has followed us throughout this journey, a vessel moving through the silent depths, surrounded by darkness, carrying a library, carrying knowledge, carrying fragments of humanity's highest achievements. The deeper meaning of that image is not escape. It is burden. Nemo becomes the guardian of something he can no longer fully trust the world to preserve. That burden changes a person. Because once you begin measuring reality against its highest possibilities, ordinary compromises become difficult to accept. The consequence is psychological before it is political. Disappointment becomes vigilance. Vigilance becomes distance. Distance becomes solitude. Not because connection is impossible, but because every connection is measured against a standard that reality rarely satisfies. This is where the legacy expands beyond one character and becomes a reflection of human nature itself. Across history, some of the most influential thinkers, reformers, artists, and visionaries have shared a similar tension. They loved an idea so deeply that they could not ignore the ways it was being betrayed. Their criticism emerged from commitment rather than detachment. Their frustration emerged from care rather than indifference. And yet there is a paradox hidden inside that pattern. The very people who push civilization forward are often the people most wounded by its failures. The scale now shifts once again. We are no longer talking about a fictional captain beneath the ocean. We are talking about every generation that inherits a gap between ideals and reality. Every society teaches values. Every institution claims principles. Every culture creates stories about what it stands for. But eventually each generation faces the same test. Will those values remain living commitments, or will they become decorative symbols? This is why the strongest memory fragments in the story continue to resonate. The observation window. The endless ocean. The silent library. The solitary vessel. Each one represents a different aspect of the same question. How do you remain loyal to what is best in humanity without becoming consumed by disappointment in what humanity actually is? The answer is never fully resolved. That is part of the story's enduring power. Nemo's influence does not come from providing certainty. It comes from forcing us to confront a tension that has no easy solution. His legacy is the reminder that ideals can inspire greatness, but they can also create wounds when reality repeatedly falls short of them. Yet perhaps the most important consequence is this. Even after all the disappointment, the ideals remain. The library remains. The search remains. The belief that humanity could become something better remains. And that leaves us with a final paradox before we move forward. If abandoning ideals leads to cynicism, but clinging to them can lead to isolation, then where does a person stand? How do you remain faithful to humanity's highest possibilities without becoming either naive or withdrawn? And perhaps an even deeper mystery remains unresolved. Was Nemo ultimately defeated by civilization's failures, or by his refusal to lower his expectations of what humanity could be? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after its technology has become familiar and its imagined future has become part of our past. Its deepest insight was never about machines, exploration, or even the ocean. It was about a tension that remains unresolved within the human condition itself. Somewhere in the darkness beneath the waves, we are left with a handful of images that refuse to disappear. A silent vessel moving through an endless sea. A library preserved far from the noise of the world. A window looking outward into vast darkness. These are not merely symbols within a story. They are reflections of questions that follow people throughout their lives. Every generation inherits dreams about what humanity could become. Every generation discovers that reality is more complicated than those dreams. Yet what determines the course of a life is often not whether disappointment arrives. Disappointment arrives for everyone. The deeper question is what happens afterward. Some people respond by lowering their expectations. Some abandon their ideals altogether. Others continue searching for something worthy of those ideals, even when that search becomes lonely. That is the legacy that remains. Not certainty. Not answers. A form of loyalty. A loyalty directed toward possibilities that may never be fully realized. In that sense, the figure at the center of this story becomes larger than a character. He becomes a mirror. Not because we share his circumstances, but because we recognize the conflict. We recognize the experience of loving something enough to be wounded by it. We recognize the temptation to withdraw when reality falls short of meaning. We recognize the desire to preserve what is valuable even when faith in surrounding systems begins to weaken. And perhaps that is why the ocean remains such a powerful final image. The ocean is neither judgment nor redemption. It is depth. A reminder that beneath every institution, every ideology, every civilization, there exists a deeper layer of questions that no generation fully resolves. Questions about truth. Questions about purpose. Questions about whether human beings are defined more by their failures or by their aspirations. The story leaves those questions open. It does not offer a final verdict because the verdict belongs to each generation that encounters it. The vessel continues moving through the darkness. The library remains intact. The observation window still faces outward. The possibility of human greatness remains preserved, suspended somewhere between hope and reality. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is not that ideals inevitably fail, nor that civilization inevitably disappoints. Perhaps it is that the distance between what humanity is and what humanity could become is the very space where meaning is created. Yet one final question remains, lingering long after the story ends. When the world repeatedly falls short of its highest promises, is wisdom found in lowering those promises to match reality, or in refusing to lower them, even when carrying them becomes the heaviest burden of all?